Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another DADCAW. It is 10:06 p.m. It's the evening of Wednesday, August 26th, 2020. Recording this log and having just sat down some programming for the day, having already sat down my mod stream for the day. I mean, it's the end of the day, but one more thing coming at you. It's this DADCAW. Hello. Welcome. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Hydra's new game state, obviously, but I wanted to do so in a bit more of an abstract way, sort of using it as the jump-off point for a broader point or point of discussion, whatever. And I wanted to talk a little bit about engines and essentially limits, really. I'm talking about tool sets, ultimately, and the kinds of things that they do psychologically to either inhibit or empower the creativity of a developer. And Brood War's engine is very limiting, but it's just one part of the tool set, really. Because when you're making something like a single-player RTS campaign, like I'm working on Deliverance recently, and that's what I've been making, or if you're making something that is multiplayer, but still has some element of a story, a setting, if you will, a large portion of that is informed by what tools that you already have at your disposal. So if you're not making a total conversion, if you're not completely removing Terran, Zerg, and Protoss, if you're not influencing the setting with your own original creations, you are taking other stuff from other sources. In this case, the source is StarCraft, and you're taking those elements and you're using them, right? So in a sense, that's already in some ways inhibiting your creativity. I would say in more ways than it's helping, it's inhibiting it, but it's also empowering you to sort of skip past your own series of world buildings. I mean, that's pretty much why anybody does fan fiction anyways. So they can skip past the, I don't know if you would call it the boring stuff, but it's certainly very difficult stuff. The stuff where you have to do all your setup and you've got to figure out everything that you want to do, and you got to set all that shit up so that you can get to the point where you can tell stories. And you also have to figure out how to information control it, how to sort of communicate that information to the players or to the readers or whatever your medium is. The audience that you have for your work, they need to be brought up to speed of whatever you've done. And so there's a ton of different reasons why I've been thinking about this lately. And one of them is because in Deliverance, I have been working under the assumption that the project itself is alt history. It diverts very heavily from the default story. And as a result, it's not actually intended to be, it's not intended to be canon, we'll say. And so I have part of the saddle, or I've been saddled with part of the payload, the burden of what every fanfiction writer, in essence, is saddled with, which is the source material. I've taken a lot of liberties there, and I've been able to free myself with a lot more of it, but I'm still using the core setting, and even the core elements of the story. Like, Zerg are still invading Higher, and Terran, Zerg, and Protoss still exist. So yeah, there's a ton of new tech, and yeah, there's completely new cast of characters, and yeah, we make it very obvious that we're diverging from canon by killing off one of the characters that is in the original story, like having him be dead before the player even arrives, and the player learns of the death of that character. And that's like a way to, like a jumping off point to figure out, oh, this is not a canon story. This is going its own way. Okay. And, that sort of explains why we got everybody moving around and all these new characters and all this new tech. And, of course, the new Terran interlopers that show up as a main antagonizing force. And so even for Deliverance itself, like I'm not just dealing with the engine limitations, but I'm also dealing with some storytelling limitations. I've been able to buck a lot of those by virtue of the project being a little off the wall in its construction, but a lot of people don't have that luxury. A lot of people who are working on custom content or have worked on custom content in the past, because for sure there's been a lot more people who have in the past at some point worked on a custom campaign for StarCraft compared to the number of people who are actively working on stuff right now. They have also sort of contended with this particular issue and the issue of how much do I change and how much can I change and all that stuff. And some people are fine with it because they don't really have as many aspirations to be wholly creative, completely creative, and take complete control over all the decisions that are made about their story. because that is a lot of work, as I mentioned before. But when it comes to the engine themselves, or the sort of the environments that you're working within technically, when it comes to the programming and when it comes to the implementation of certain concepts like custom behaviors or AI or whatever the case may be, you are limited also in that element. Your toolkit is certainly very heavily limited. And that's something you can't really escape from, unfortunately. It's something that, try as you might, the only way to fix that is to slowly reverse engineer the whole damn thing, or to make your own whole damn thing. And you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, I guess. That's one way to tie that all together. So one of the things that has been making me think about this is the fact that, of course, after Full Toilet is, comes and goes, right? After it's over, we're planning on working on our own engine. And so we're pretty much just trying to make ends meet until then. We're just trying to make this shitty fucking tool set work for as long as it can, just for this one last hurrah before we move on. And we don't really know what that looks like in some cases. But it does look like a ton of concessions. On some cases, it looks like, well, it's about as chaotic as it sounds, I guess, insofar as we were originally planning a huge, data structure enhancer that would extend all of the data limits, completely change how the underhood of the game goes in terms of its data structure, so that we could have unlimited unit entries and weapon entries and so on and so forth. But that turned into something that would require months and months of work. And if we're already planning on spending months and months of our time making our own engine, which can be infinitely edited since we will have access to the source code, there's not much of a reason to bother spending months and months doing something that is not going to be nearly as future useful, right? Useful in the future. It's not going to be nearly as much of a valuable learning experience. We can't take the work with us, and we can't really take the lessons that we learn from working on that with us either. And so there's not really much of a justification that you can come up with. A lot of your life is going to be trying to rationalize whatever difficult decisions you have to make, or whatever insane amounts of man hours you have to spend on stuff. And StarCraft is one of those things where I have worked tirelessly, day in and day out, for many, many years now, whether on stream or not, to try to produce high-quality content. And yet, only recently have I realized just how limiting this engine has been. Now, thankfully, I've long since moved on from the idea that I'm going to try to improve the story or the lore or whatever. Really, I'm only interested in telling my own stories, and that includes when it comes to the factions and stuff. And while I can see some potential in what Blizzard left behind from their Warhammer 40,000 fanfiction game, I personally do not apply a whole lot of worth or value to it, and I would much rather make my own shit. It's just that I'm limited not only in art assets, but also, of course, with the engine itself. So for the time being, I have deigned, if you will, to work on this content, work on within the universe of StarCraft, because it's just not practical to try to make your own race's assets, right? That's a rabbit hole I have not gone into just yet. Now, that being said, I will eventually pick up 3D modeling and stuff, because it seems I am the only one who would be capable of well, I'm a person who would be capable of contributing towards the goal of eventually having custom art for everything. I also wanted to get into particles and a bunch of other stuff. So there's all sorts of different things that I'll eventually be getting into on the graphical side, just like I got into programming somewhat recently for the sake of improving engine development and all that stuff. And that will be a very, very useful asset when it comes to having another person who is dedicated to the cause, who is interested in producing something that is performant and that is sustainable for the future. And that will eventually allow us to move forward with content development once we get the engine itself taken care of. Once we finish building the sandbox, we can actually make our castle, as it were. If you've never been to the beach before, you may not know what the fuck I'm talking about, but, Generally speaking, the engine of StarCraft has limited me in many ways. And I'll give you some concrete examples now, because I think I've stated my case enough times. If you look at a recent unit that I've been trying to implement for Hydra, is actually a Zergling morph that turns into an air unit, and it's called the Nathricor. At least that's its current name. And basically, one of the things that I had in mind was I was curious to see if we could make a unit that behaves somewhat like the Interceptor does, where it has this strafing pattern, where after attacking it will bank, or it will make a turn, or perhaps it would just fly past the target and only to turn around as part of its animation. And this would, of course, be interruptible at any time, but that would be basic behavior of the unit. And maybe it would not have worked out. In fact, I could even go on the record and say it's probably something that would not have worked out, because it would have been a fragile unit, and it probably would have flown into base defenses or something after trying to harass minerals, and it just would have led to less control. But it's a good example of the engine limiting us, because in a perfect world, I would say, I kind of want to do that. And then I would make the necessary steps to program that in, or iQuire or Veek would, or whoever, somebody would program it in, we would test it out, and I would say, oh, it does or does not work because of these things. And maybe that would have learned me something, right? Maybe that would have been a lesson that could have imparted, like, oh yeah, well, now I can like tone this down, or I can change this aspect of it, or I can just keep this in mind for designing future units. Maybe I can update the interceptor's behavior itself, and all that stuff would have been taken care of. But just to make that one change, to make a unit instead of the interceptor, well, in addition to the interceptor, move like the interceptor does with that strafing pattern, it apparently would have been an insane ordeal that would have taken weeks, if not a month, just to finish and make it happen. And the idea that something that basic is not even allowed to be explored as a concept is insane to me. It's one of those things that really just makes you think. Like, if I can't do something that basic conceptually, what kind of lesson does that actually teach me about working within this engine? Well, now if I ever come up with another unit concept, assuming I have to, right? Say I'm trying to come up with another fighter concept, a small craft of either race, of any race rather, that may well have some sort of pathfinding associated change to it that makes it behave somewhat differently or somewhat uniquely. Well, I'm never going to consider the strafing pattern now, because I know that that's just off limits. It's sort of similar to another example that I have for you is there was an upgrade plan for the Firebat back when we were still doing upgrades. And this upgrade was simply going to increase the maximum HP of the unit. It's not very interactive. It's not very interesting, really. And after some thought, I realized that it would have been better off as some sort of maybe an ability, a positional ability that increases max HP, or something like that. Maybe a certain healer could overheal, right? Something like that. I could see some value in exploring the idea, but in a different context. I never got a chance to do that, though, because we needed something like 100 different wrappers or something. I'm sure I'm going to get the specifics wrong, and iQuire will write a comment saying, actually, that would have only taken 2 weeks, and actually, there's only 6 wrappers or something. But there's an insane amount of work just to make something like that change, just to add 5 or 10 HP to the Firebat as an upgrade. So we never got a chance to see if it would have worked or not. We never got a chance to see how interactive it was or was not. And while I can poke holes in the concept all day, it's a poor representation, a poor replacement for just plugging it into the game, testing it, and then making my determinations from those tests. You just can't even begin to do that in StarCraft's environment, which is really unfortunate, and one of the main reasons why I'm very much looking forward to the new engine. A similar case is available as another final example. There's an upgrade that I had planned for robotic units for Protoss called Auto Vitality, and it was certainly going to be very strange. I don't know how I would have exactly implemented it, but the idea was that it 1.5x'd the shields of all robotic units, which, yes, would have included probes. So, obviously, this is an upgrade that, again, I'm not sure how interesting or engaging or interactive it actually would have been. But it probably would have evolved into some sort of behavior that would have later be used by Clarions or some other enhancement unit, some utility unit, that would have allowed you to overheal your shields. And maybe they would have slowly degenerated, like at the same decay rate or at the same regeneration rate, right? Their degeneration rate would be identical to shield regeneration rate or something like that. I don't know. Maybe you won't even need that, and it's just fine to be overhealed. You just can't regenerate back over it or something. Maybe that could have happened. But it couldn't have happened because it needed a similar workload to the max HP thing if I wanted to increase max shields. Basic shit like this being behind an insane programming workload wall, a barrier that, while we could deal with, would require an insane amount of legwork instead of just being able to test out a concept, is really what hinders us when it comes to actually exploring these different ideas. I also will give another example of this idea, even though it wasn't exactly something that was really there. A while back, I was talking with Chalks, Microman, author of a StarCraft 2 fucking Ghost campaign map. I don't know. Check him out, I guess. Look up Zorbotron and then punch him in the head. That guy and I were talking about all these crazy ideas. And he's a micro guy, like I said. You know, I was poking fun at him. And he said that it would have been really cool to at some point have had an engine where you could just try all this crazy shit, where he could try his weird micro stuff where you got like 3 units and you're really trying to micro them well, and I could try my insane macro style where you got like 10 bases or whatever, and we could 1v1 each other with this insane setup where he designs his race and I design my race, or he designs his mechanics and I design my mechanics. And it would just the idea alone, you know, that really stuck with me. The idea that like as zany as the specific example could be, the idea that one day we might have an actual engine that could support something like that, where somebody just designs an entire race, including a bunch of custom mechanics for that race, because they have access to the ability to do like the tools required to make that happen. I don't care what the context is. I don't care if you're designing a fucking anime race. The idea that it could possibly happen, because I'm empowering the creator to do that. And then you could like duke it out 1v1 me with my race versus your race. And you know, that could be really cool. Now, obviously most cases it would just be like my race is overpowered and who can be more overpowered than the other guy. And it would just devolve into slapstick. But in the cases where somebody actually tried to make their race balanced, or somebody had some zany mechanic or whatever that was still interesting regardless of many potential imbalances, you could easily see why that's a good thing, a net positive for any community trying to make content for a game. And that's what it comes down to, is we're just trying to make content. That's all I've ever really wanted to do with StarCraft, is make content. I wanted to make my own content. I wanted to tell my own stories. I wanted to have my own races. I wanted to have my own environments. I may not have the graphical chops to actually get that stuff done, but as much as it's been a journey of personal growth to learn programming, it's also something I never really should have had to do to the level that I've had to, where I've had to specialize in assembly and a bunch of other stuff, as useful as that may be in the future. It was a ridiculous imposition to require in order to just do basic things, like attempt to add health to a unit, or something to that effect. These are not really even low-level changes we're talking about, but they are made low-level by the nature of the engine. The tools do not allow you, the environment does not help. And that's really the core message that I have. While the setting can be safely discarded, it's in stark contrast to the engine itself. I don't care what kind of story you want to tell. You can tell it if you can generate the assets to tell it properly, and if you can have the gall, the gusto, the chops, the chocks to design a campaign or a melee environment or whatever that it expresses your story the way that you want to. But you can't really do that on a gameplay level, on a technical level, in an engine like StarCraft's. And that's really the problem. The engine just doesn't help. And there is no RTS engine that I've ever come across in my 25 plus years of existence that even holds a candle to what StarCraft can offer you with what we know about it. So the idea that there's some hidden one around the corner is, well, let's just say, I think it's falsified at this point. But hey, man, if you want to suggest OpenRA for the 1000th time or whatever, I guess you can do that in the comment sections below. With that said, that will close this DADCAW out. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found it thought-provoking. And I hope you consider, the next time you're trying to make content for something, what might be holding you back, and why you should just join our development team to make a new engine. Because, man, fuck dealing with this. Bye.